So now that we have a nice overview of how to control the stepper, let's talk about some different applications for the stepper. So perhaps the most basic one would be creating an arpeggiation type thing with the pitch of an oscillator. So try to think for a moment where we would drag this modulation source to. If you said to the pitch slot, then you were correct. So I'm going to take stepper number 5. So I've selected stepper from over here, and I'm going to click it and take it over here to pitch. For now, let's just select the alternating octaves step sequencer just to have it right away. I'm going to turn down the glide mod. Okay, now you'll notice that when I play it, nothing will happen. You can see the step sequencer moving through the steps, but it's not actually modulating the pitch at all. So try to guess why that is. If you said that we haven't created a range, then that is correct. So what we need to do is to go up here to this pitch slot, just like with the LFO when we were talking about vibrato. We need to change this because right now what we're telling the oscillator to do is to modulate between pitch 0 to pitch 0, which is nothing. So let's drag this down an octave, or 12 semitones. So you can hear it alternating between those octaves. It's moving between 12 semitones and 0. So a note about the polarity of the stepper is that these bars in the sequencer are indicative of the amount of modulation. Okay, so that means at the bottom, at 0 here in one of these steps, we have no modulation, and at the top we have full modulation. So what that means for us is that while it would seem like this should be the low octave and this should be the high octave, because it's low and high, since we've dragged our range down to -12, -12 corresponds to the top of our step amplitude. Okay, so if we want to have the bottom octave start first, we're going to have to move this up to 12 above it. And now that just makes more sense as you're thinking about it. So so just be aware of that. Okay. Now we can also let's randomize just the levels, and I'm gonna delete these glide mods for now. So now these are at random values. So now this is going to, at these different levels in between the octave, it's going to modulate the pitch. So we can hear that now. And our ratio is at 1/8 notes. So that's kind of cool, but let's try this instead. We want to snap it to grid so that these are numbers within their whole numbers within the scale. Now, if you know your scales pretty well, you can actually make this somewhat more musical. So we'll go 5, 4. So we'll go 7, 5, 11, 2, 5, 7, 12. And let's just keep that short so we're not wasting a bunch of time. So you can hear some of that. It's kind of an arpeggiated kind of sound. You can also increase the ratio so it happens faster. Okay. Now let's bring this ratio back down so we can hear this a little bit better. Let's try using some glide mod. So I'm just going to select a few random boxes below some of the steps, and I'm going to increase my glide mod fader a little bit. So that means I'm telling the sequencer to glide in between these modulation levels. So that's kind of cool. You can hear that some of them are sweeping in between each other. That's kind of a nice effect to have. Let's remove this modulation, and now let's try dropping this into the amplitude knob. So we want the actual level of the amplitude knob to be at the bottom so that no modulation is here at the bottom. That corresponds with 0 amplitude, and then we want the range to go over the entire course of the amplitude. So that means that these levels in the step sequencer, well, why don't you guess for a moment what these will mean? They will mean that this knob is landing on certain parts of over this range indicated by this green halo. So this one is, about halfway. This one is at full volume. So you'll hear how that affects the amplitude knob. And without any of the glide. So that way I am creating these random steps that are modulating this amplitude, which is pretty cool. And I can throw this into, for example, the intensity knob as well, so that it's emphasizing that movement. Try it with the formant oscillator mode. So you can hear some of that. It's pretty cool. We can change the ratio. Now let's try throwing an LFO in here to modulate that modulation. So I'm going to take LFO 6 and just have it as a sine wave with a sort of middle rate like that. And I'm going to throw that side chain onto our stepper. So that means this is going to move in and out of that modulation on the intensity knob. And since we can try syncing it to a different ratio, since the stepper is in 1/12 notes, we can make this ratio maybe 1/4 so that there's some nice character and movement. And if we try throwing an effect on here, which we'll talk more about later, but you'll be able to hear a little bit more of that of the effect there. Let's see how this sounds if we change the ratio. So I personally like that the most, actually, at 1-to-1 ratio. Nice sine curve LFO is sidechaining the number 5 stepper. And then our amplitude knob is being modulated by that stepper as well. So the stepper is perhaps best for creating some pretty extreme movement in these different parameters, because by its nature it's sort of these these rigid steps like this. You can create cool grooves and just nice rhythm to your sounds. In fact, let's try to blow this up even more. So I'm going to put my number 5 stepper into the amplitude knob and do the same thing here with my white noise. And I maybe don't want it to go all the way to the top of the range because I don't want too much noise. But this is going to insert some noise at the same step rhythm as the amplitude of my oscillator. And now if I want to change the color over that course of the LFO, I can put the 6th LFO here into the color knob, and I can have it be maybe here at about 2 o'clock and have a little bit of a smaller range. And let's hear how that sounds. So that's a way to create some consistency in your sounds, because this LFO number 6 is modulating this color knob. It's also sidechaining my intensity knob. So these are happening at the same rate. These parameters are changing at the same rate. And then my 5th stepper, number 5 stepper, is modulating the intensity, the amplitude, and of this oscillator, as well as the amplitude of my noise. So that's pretty cool. Now I have a cool little rhythmic sound that's going, and you can maybe play around with some of these other factory settings in the stepper just to see what they're doing. It even has major pentatonic scale like this. But that, of course, would make more sense when you're modulating the pitch. Something called the chicken. Looks pretty similar. Okay, so those are some of the different applications that you can, for which you can use the stepper. But all of these parameters, I would encourage you to play around with applying steppers to all these different parameters. For example, different controls within the inserts, or even the modulation oscillator, some of the effects, or even the EQ. Okay, so there are many different applications of the stepper, but we've talked about a few of them, and we'll get into a little bit more of specifics when we are building our own sounds later on in the course. All right, that's the stepper. See you in the next lecture.